All right, in this third screencast, we have our Altus Director instance up and running. It's also running a bind DNS server and the MariaDB database, MariaDB or MySQL, for the metadata that's used both by Director and for the instances in our cluster. So let's take a look at what we have over on that instance. I have a shell over at this instance that I had created in the previous video. And we have in our directory, brought over by our script, something called Macathon Director. That's the repository from GitHub where all the source material resides. So if I take a look at this and see what's in here, we've got a lot of things, some of which will be relevant to our usage. We had already used Provision Azure, and that script invoked the Configure Director instance to install all of our software and configure it. But now it's time to bring up a cluster. For that, we have a configs directory and a specific config that will include some of these other configuration files as part of its modular design. So let's take a look right now at the configs on Macathon Director, config CDH5, CDSW1. So we're using Director 6, remember, but this particular config file will bring up a CDH5 cluster with Data Science Workbench as part of the thing that it does. So the things to take note of at the beginning, this is not a completely general purpose config. It's meant to be modular, and you can, if you need HA or if you need Kerberos, you can add those things in as include files. If you want to use different cloud providers, you can comment and uncomment single lines. So there are environment variables that will be similar to the provisioning script. Owner tag, SSH username. If you want to override admin for the CM admin user and admin pass, you can do that. And then instance prefix. So this is the first thing that I modify. I make sure it's GG so that the instances come up with my initials, GG admin, GG master, GG CDSW, etc. The environment name is something that is the environment credentials for the cloud platform that you're logging into. In the UI, it is this aspect, add environment. And the environment is either going to be AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud Platform. As you can see here, those are your choices. We'll see them rather than using the wizard, which you're welcome to do, and then you can export config files from a successful deployment in the wizard. But we're going to start purely from the command client. The deployment name is similar to the Cloudera Manager. So deployment is equivalent to Cloudera Manager. If you have you can have one deployment and many clusters. So one Cloudera Manager managing many clusters. And you simply specify that by deployment name here within the environment. And then the name of the cluster. And then we've got providers. So a provider will be whatever is appropriate to log in to that particular cloud platform. So as an example, the Azure provider looks like this. That includes all of the things that you need to authenticate to your account on Azure. So that's the subscription ID, the tenant ID, the client ID, and the client secret, which you will get when you go through the process of applying for access to Azure using your Cloudera-demo email account. And as far as terminology, tenant ID is a subscription client or tied to it. It's always going to be the same for everyone in your group, in your SA group or SE group. Client ID and client secret are the app ID and the key value that you were sent in the email when you signed up for access with Cloudera. So I'm going to change this to something that's relevant to my values, and we've got that part taken care of. The next thing that we need to do is make sure that we've got the right cloud provider instance defaults. So for that, this will be different for the different cloud providers. The idea is you can use the exact same cluster config file, whether you're deploying on Google Cloud, Azure, or AWS. The only difference will be the difference in the provider section, and you'll have at least a difference in the instance defaults. Any of these things may be overridden for specific instance groups, like your workers. You're not going to want to have 0 data disks on your workers. You're going to want to have multiple disks for HDFS. And you might want a larger instance for a CDSW master, for instance, and a much smaller instance possibly for a gateway. So you can override these later. But this instance defaults section is meant to be all of the defaults that will be mostly repeated throughout your different instance groups. So I'll go ahead and change this to match my setup. So these are the values that I'll be using, and as to a question, how do you know what these values should be? Well, similar to what we looked at before in the console, if I do something as simple as just look at the running instance that I have for Director, I'll see that I've got this this particular VNet, this particular subnet. So that's my GG Director VNet, my GG Director subnet. That's where I get those names from. One way to see all of the resources that are currently assigned to your group is just to search for your resource group and look at all of the assets that are underneath it. So that's where we get some of this stuff as well. So the things that I needed were the network security group, the subnet, the VNet, and really that's it. This instance name prefix here is just something that the instances will be prefixed with. So you can change that in the main configuration file for each instance group. So your masters have one prefix, your workers another prefix, and so forth. And we'll see all that. So we're done with the differences that we're making to this thing. And then the last thing in here would be my private key. What is my private key that's going to be used on the network? I'm going to show you the entire process that I use. I actually go over to this is a remote, so this is the SSH directory in the Director instance, and I copy over one of the keys that I use for Azure here. So I actually copy that Gregory G. Azure key over there, and then I have one problem with it here, which is that key has a passphrase. So if I, for instance, want to add it to my agent, it's going to ask me for the passphrase. This is going to be a problem on Director, so I want to remove the passphrase from this key just on the Director instance, not on my laptop, but just on the Director instance. And this is how I do that. I can use the command ssh keygen -p to change passwords, -f to point to the file and point to that key. It'll ask me what my old passphrase is, and then I'm going to just type enter for no passphrase to remove it. So now when I add this to my keychain, or to my agent I should say, it does not ask for a passphrase. So that's going to work. That's going to work well for Director. And the last thing then I have to do is say add that path into as my private key. Everything else in this is going to be something that you don't need to edit. But notice for each group, like Cloudera Manager, I take the instance name prefix and I change it. So I take the defaults, I copy them all over with this simple syntax, and then I override one of them. So the instance name prefix will be gg-cm in this case. And we'll see the same when we go into the cluster instances. So we go like workers, they'll have 4 data disks. It'll be 500 gigabytes each. They've got their roles assigned, and they've got an instance name prefix that is specific to the workers. So we do that with everything. Let's take one final look to the values that I want to go with. These ones up front are my SSH username, CMadmin user and pass. I usually go with something different, but I don't want to put passwords in plain text here for this. So I'll stick with admin, and everything else is good. So when I go to the command line, this is what it looks like. It's as simple as doing Cloudera Director as the client, telling it to bootstrap remote using the config file that we just completed. And this will actually connect to the server that's running on this same instance. So we'll be able to monitor it from either the command line. I'll go ahead and show you what the command line outputs right now, or switch over to the web UI and navigate from there. Now when you start out in Cloudera Altus Director in the dashboard, you'll see whatever deployments are going on. So we see there's something in progress right now. We look at the deployment and we are ready already to navigate to Cloudera Manager, though there's a caveat with that. And our cluster instances are working through their processing right now. Now, how do we get to Cloudera Manager? This is something I'm going to show you right now, something that will not work. If you're on the VPN, the company VPN, this might work, but it's related to the proxy rules that you have for yourself and the network that you have. So when I say navigate to Cloudera Manager, it's trying to go directly to the internal IP address. Now with the SOX proxy, that's fine, but my proxy rules that I prefer do not go by IP address. They go by host name. So I'm expecting to find something with a domain of cdh-cluster.internal in order to route properly. It will still resolve to that same IP address, but the proxy rules that I use go by name. So here's what it looks like. When I look at properties, I see that there is the private FQDN is completely specified here. So I can simply copy that, open a new tab, and open up port 7180 or 7183, depending on how I brought the cluster up. And sure enough, Cloudera Manager is there. See what state it's in. It is currently working on installing Cloudera agents on a couple of the remaining nodes, and it has downloaded our parcels. So the next steps will be for Cloudera Manager to distribute and activate those parcels and then build up the cluster. And we can see that either from the web UI or from this command line that we started with that Cloudera Director command. We'll come back once that's further along. And the script has finished running, the bootstrap remote script. If everything goes right, you see something that looks like this. You see your metadata databases have been created, and it finally says the magic cluster is ready. So let's have a look in Cloudera Manager, and we see what looks like the healthy cluster. Cloudera Data Science Workbench may or may not show up red. It takes a very long time to come up at first because Kubernetes and Docker are very, very busy downloading images. So let's see, take a look at that host and see what's going on. Whoops, not Google Cloud, but Azure. Data Science Workbench, Data Science Workbench Master is on 10.0.0.11. And notice there are no public IP addresses on any of these cluster nodes, only on our director instance. So to get to the cluster nodes, we have to go make a hop through our director instance. So the way to do this is you can do it, of course you don't have to use Emacs, but life is better if you do. And you can SSH first to Azure Director and then from there SSH to 0.11. We'll get the directory listing there and then grab a shell. So we're grabbing a shell. I have already loaded this CDSW master with software that I like, such as Fortune and Cowsay. So it's all ready to go. If we look at Docker images, those have all downloaded. And Docker PS, we've already got to the point where instances in Docker are running. So let's do CDSW status. And now I'm going to encounter a bug that I'll show you. It tells me immediately that Data Science Workbench is not ready with no additional details. For those of us that are very strange and run terminals inside of other environments, like inside of IntelliJ or inside of Emacs or Vim, but we're not doing terminal emulation, our term is set to dumb. And the bug is you'll get a status not ready even if that's not true. So if we go and set term to something that is recognized, then we get a more realistic status. So this is a bug that will soon be squashed in production, but as of 1.4.x of CDSW, it is still a bug. So all of these things are coming up, so we should be good to go in our cluster. One of the reasons that Cloudera Data Science Workbench may not come up is that its name service is not resolving. So that's something you need to pay close attention to. Let's take a quick look at the configuration and look at non-default values. So our Data Science Workbench domain is CDSW internal. That means that our nodes should be able to resolve cdsw.internal, and it should come back as 10.0.0.11. So you'll have to update that if you've got a different IP address and you're getting the wrong thing coming back from the bind DNS. You can also do it's wildcard DNS, remember. So anything.cdsw.internal should return that same thing. And if that's not working, then the workbench can't come up completely. So just verify that, and that's probably a pretty common source of problems. The next rev of these scripts is going to make sure that the IP address that gets assigned for the CDSW master is in fact registered with the DNS server on the director instance. At this stage, it's not registering because it's a static IP address that's in the config, but we're going to make that so that it's more dynamic and can register. The next step for you to consider is to get data ingested into the cluster through the gateway node, and then processing and making use of looking at lineage in Navigator, looking at history and diagnostics in Workload XM, and using projects in Data Science Workbench, of course. All right, that's for another video. Thank you.